Good evening, guys. My name is Emily Maltby, and this is my thematic unit plan. This is my general layout here. I decided to go with a science unit, and I decided to go with third grade. I've done first grade in some classes and fifth grade in other classes, so I thought it would be nice to settle in the middle for this one. And for my element, I chose air. And the title of the unit is going to be weather and how it relates to air. And my rationale behind choosing it is that air can relate to both weather and climate, which is a very important standard in the third grade science area. So I definitely want to touch on all of those. Wind and air pressure also affect our region, especially here in southern New Mexico. So the students can apply the knowledge to their personal life and culture. I know we've recently been going through windy season, and so I thought, it would be that'd be a great time to maybe do this unit when we could maybe take the students outside and they could do some observations. So as far as my standards and objectives go, I went ahead and chose a few standards that I plan on using at least once. Some of them I used more than once to call back and activate prior knowledge with the students. The first one is to represent data in tables and graphical displays to describe typical weather conditions expected during a particular season. And gives examples: temperature, precipitation, wind direction, which is something obviously wind direction, air we would want to focus on. And it does give an assessment boundary that assessment is limited to pictographs and bar graphs, and that it does not include climate change. So I had to be sure to specifically not include that here in my lesson plan, which is kind of difficult because I always did want to come back to climate change, but that is later. The next standard that I was going to be using in my thematic unit was that students will obtain and combine information to describe climates in different regions of the world, more specifically our region here in New Mexico, so that they can relate to it a little more. Next, students will be able to make a claim about the merit of a design solution that reduces the impacts of a weather-related hazard. The weather-related hazard that we focus on is going to be tornadoes and windstorms. The next one is natural hazards. Students will be able to deal with a variety of natural hazards resulting from natural processes. Humans cannot eliminate natural hazards, but they can take steps to reduce their impacts. And so that way the students can start to think about that and how they can act and reduce the impacts of non-preventable natural disasters. So lesson one, the title is Weather in New Mexico. So it's going to be focusing on windy season. I thought it would be nice to start the first lesson with something that all of the students in this area can relate to: windy season. I know personally, I live in a dirt lot and it gets pretty crazy in windy season. And so the standards that I plan on hitting in this first lesson would be the representation of the data, and then the natural hazards. And then down here for our language learners, explain. That is going to be the big standard that we hit on for MLLs to make sure that we are being culturally and linguistically responsive to them, and so that they can be able to explain these things at the end to help with their language development. So we'll be asking questions like, can wind be dangerous? Sometimes we think of wind as a breeze, but sometimes air can be dangerous, and we are going to talk about that. I know I've had students say they don't like it when they have to ride in the car when it's super windy because they can feel the wind on the car. And so we can talk about those experiences like that. Dust levels, for instance, as well. And for the activity, students will make a bar graph representing the wind speeds during a week of windy season in Las Cruces, and this will be used as an assessment on their understanding and application of representing data in the graphs. And so that is just a general overview of lesson one, and they will be predicting possible future wind patterns in accordance to the standard. Overview of lesson number two, we're going to hit extreme weather, and more specifically Tornado Alley. We're going to hit these two standards here. obtaining and combining information to describe climates in different regions of the world. In this instance, Tornado Alley, discussing how air can turn into extreme weather, and then the natural hazards, of course. We're going to start with a video to get the students hooked and interested. And then as an activity and a hands-on science kind of experiment activity that the students will get to do will be to create a tornado in a bottle, which is actually the one lesson that I decided to do my actual detailed lesson plan on was this day 2 lesson. So we'll get into that in detail later. And again, for our MLLs, we want them to hit this explain standard. Lesson 3, windstorms, dust storms. We're going to talk about that. They do happen here in New Mexico, but they can also happen in many other places in the world. And students are going to collaborate with each other in groups, and this will help with their language development as well, to come up with a creative way to harness wind or air. Lesson 4 is going to be on wind farms, and it's going to hit this one standard here, as well as the MLL standard down here for explaining again. The students are going to have to collaborate in groups for this one, and they're going to discuss windmills. As an assessment, students are going to discuss new or different designs to their windmill and try to come up with efficient solutions. This way they can be hands-on and really do the science with each other and collaborate and also work on those language skills. And lastly, an overview of my lesson number 5 is going to be focusing on air pressure, also known as barometric pressure. It's going to be hitting on these standards here, obtaining and combining information once again, and then natural hazards and explaining for our CRLT/SIOP inclusion element. Also known as standard atmospheric pressure, we want to make sure we introduce that academic vocabulary to the students. We're going to ask, does air weigh anything? What is air pressure? What do you think of when you think of air pressure? I know my first thought is tire pressure. And so we could use the example of the PSI in a car tire to explain the concept of air having pressure. And then we will talk about how it affects climate and weather. And then we are going to call back to our previous lesson on tornadoes. And then we're going to discuss how air pressure affects us here in southern New Mexico. And this is a great opportunity for students to kind of compare and contrast with maybe northern New Mexico and how air pressure is there at a higher elevation. And then here is my detailed lesson plan template. And as I said, I decided to use the lesson 2 on tornadoes. My specific standard is the science standard natural hazards. A variety of natural hazards result from natural processes. Humans cannot eliminate natural hazards, but can take steps to reduce their impacts. This disciplinary core idea is also addressed by this other standard. The next standard is going to be to obtain and combine information to describe climates in different regions of the world. And then to be culturally and linguistically responsive, we have our MLL standard down here because we want to make sure our students are practicing explaining these concepts so that they can gain more academic vocabulary and continue to grow their language development in the classroom. And my learning objective for this lesson is after the lesson, students will be able to understand tornadoes and how they work by obtaining information and making their own tornado in a bottle. And this is an activity that I have done with younger students before. I tried to do it with preschool. Didn't go too well. It was a little too messy. So I think 3rd grade would be perfect for that. And then for my language objective, multilingual learners will be able to explain by sharing their thinking with others about what they have learned about tornadoes and describe their activity. So back again to that explain standard, we want to really work on describing. And for our instructional processes, we're using the SIOP sequence, which starts with motivation or building background. And the teacher will start the lesson by bringing up the previous day's lesson on wind and windy season here in New Mexico. And just get the students talking, maybe show a video. You can also do a turn and talk. Personally, I would start with a KWL chart so that the students have the first input and they can look back on what they had to say as the unit goes on. We would start with sticky notes to do in the want to know section, or excuse me, we would start with the know section, what they do know about tornadoes or Tornado Alley. And then for the W, they would write down one thing they do want to know. And those are things we're going to revisit at the end of the lesson. For number 2, it's presentation. So after some discussion with the whole class, a turn and talk show this YouTube video. I have the link right here to introduce the basics of tornadoes to the class. After the video, have students do a turn and talk about their thoughts on tornadoes after the video, and it can be in pairs or if they're in small groups, that works as well. Teacher will bring the class back together and have the group share what they discussed with their peers. And after the engagement from the class, after everyone has gotten to say what they want to say, guided by the teacher will give the instructions for the activity. And one thing I've learned is give the instructions before we give the materials. Otherwise, they're going to be messing with the materials instead of listening to the instructions. So for practice and application, we're going to practice that, and then the teacher can model making the tornado in the bottle for the students, or show this video linked below. If they would rather do that, it's up to the teacher and the students in the class. Enlist one student from each group to come up and get enough supplies for everyone in their group. Students will follow along with the steps that the teacher either modeled with themselves or through the video, and choose food coloring and or glitter. Glitter is definitely optional because it can get very messy. But it is a great way to show how the tornado and the air in the tornado picks up debris and moves it around. And lastly, for review and assessment, after the activity, we review the objective, and we're going to have students experiment and share with their bottles. And then we're going to discuss and explain why the bottles work and how it's like how real tornadoes form. And then, of course, they get to take it home to show their families after I have seen it and heard them explain as a form of assessment. Now, this lesson includes oral, visual, and kinesthetic discourse. Oral, obviously, because we are talking whole class and in pairs and groups. Visual, because of the video and also the visual aspect of the tornadoes in the bottles. And it's something that all MLLs and students of any language proficiency can do, as well as the kinesthetic aspect of it, despite or regardless of where your language development is. You can make this science experiment. You can make this tornado in the bottle, and it can show you how this works as opposed to just having to listen to it. And then as far as the classroom learning environment goes, we have whole group, obviously, and then we have pairs for our turn-in talks. And then if your students are seated in groups, obviously we'll keep them in their small groups unless you would rather have them in pairs. For materials and resources, we need empty water bottles for everybody, depending on the students you have in your class. Duct tape or tornado adapter. I have done this activity with both. I will say the tornado adapter definitely is more useful, but the duct tape will work as long as it's secured really well. Water, obviously, for the tornado, food coloring as well, and then the glitter, obviously optional. Food coloring can even be optional as well, especially if you're doing this with younger kids, but the color is very fun. And for the inclusion and portion of this, one of the students in my class this semester is in a wheelchair and has a one-on-one aide that helps him, as well as technological accommodations so he can participate. And I would want to make sure that all of those accommodations are in place for him so that he can participate and make his tornado, and also get that one-on-one assistance that he needs. And then students who may need extra help with the fine motor aspects of this, such as applying the tape or dropping the food coloring into the bottle, will have priority seating so that the teacher can be right there to assist them as they need. And then, of course, for our CRLT section, I have this explain standard kind of laid out more in detail here for us. MLLs will have many opportunities for linguistic differentiation, as most of the lesson is visual and or hands-on. The collaboration with their peers will be able to help them develop their language skills in a low-risk environment, with the teacher available for scaffolding and support if necessary. And then lastly, the assessment of the student's performance is just going to be informally assessed through kid watching, their interactions during class with each other, and as well during the tornado in a bottle activity. At the end, as I mentioned, the students are going to share what they made and explain why it works, and that will be how I determine if the students have reached comprehension and reached the learning and language objectives. And this is my thematic unit. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I cannot wait to watch your guys's. Have a great evening.